She told me she's going to her high school ex's birthday party, and I'm not invited. Those 7 words hit me like a lead weight and refused to leave my chest. In an instant the room shrank. The air thickened, and 1,000 tiny doubts rushed in like water through a crack. I told myself to breathe, to stay calm, to trust, but my hands were already clenching into fists I didn't know what to do with. It started off casual, the way big things often do, small and ordinary until they become the most important thing in the world. We were eating dinner, laughing about nothing, and she mentioned it like it was a footnote. My high school friends are throwing a birthday party for Jake next weekend. Jake, the name I had heard before in nostalgic conversations, the ghost of her teenage years, the portrait in the attic of her memory she sometimes dusted off and admired with a distant smile. I asked the automatic question, "Are you going?" She said yes, and I felt the first small prickle of unease. When I asked if I could go with her, she hesitated like someone deciding whether to tell a white lie, then replied with that familiar, casual brush-off, "It's more like a reunion thing. You'd be bored." That was the last time I remember forcing my face to match the calm I did not feel. From the outside it looked ridiculous. 2 adults, in a steady relationship of almost 2 years, letting a party decide the course of their lives. But that night, my mind began a slow, relentless unspooling. I started replaying old conversations, searching for clues, the way she used to describe Jake as my first real love, the way her eyes softened when she told stories about high school. I told myself to be rational. Of course she could have friends from that time. Of course she could go, but rationality is an appliance that switches off all too easily when jealousy sits in the room like an uninvited guest. Over the next week the party took on a shape in my head. She mentioned who else might be there, what line of conversation might resurface, which people had stayed the same and who had changed. Each detail felt like a small chisel working at the statue of our life together. When she smiled at a message on her phone, I could feel the temperature of my own silence rising. I knew I shouldn't be suspicious. I told myself that constantly. I also scroll-stopped on every photo she posted from that era, tried to recall whether she had spoken fondly of him or merely nostalgically, and wondered whether nostalgia was a harmless thing or a dangerous one. The night of the party arrived and she seemed buoyant, almost giddy. She tried on 3 outfits, laughed in the mirror, sprayed perfume in the way she used to when we were new and reckless. I watched her do all of these small rituals and felt suddenly like a spectator in my own relationship. I could have asked to join her. I could have insisted. Instead I stood in the doorway and said, "Have a great time," which is what people say when they're trying to appear unbothered. When she left, I watched until her taillights disappeared into the distance. And then I did something stupid. I let the silence in the apartment grow heavy enough to be physical. I turned on the television to drown out the thoughts. But the volume was a flimsy shield. Every imagined conversation between her and Jake replayed across the screen in my head like a poorly edited film. I tried to give her space. I told myself it was healthy to be apart for a few hours. I told myself not to check her social media. But a few hours of separation stretched into a night of silence. The clock ticked past midnight. At 1:30 a.m., the front door clicked and she came home, smelling faintly of perfume and, maybe, alcohol. Her cheeks were flushed, and there was a tiredness in her smile that made me ache. She said the party was nice, old friends, catching up, but then her phone buzzed, and I saw the name light up for a split second, Jake. 1-word texts, "Home," was all it took to make my stomach drop. I admit, I did something I promised myself I would never do. I let curiosity overrule trust. The temptation to pull her phone closer, to read harmless messages that transform into something else in the dark, was nearly unbearable, but I did not pry. I waited until morning and asked, carefully, measuredly, who Jake was to her now. She said they were just friends, nothing more, and that they had spent the evening reminiscing. I believed half of it. She sounded sincere, but sincerity can be an armor as much as an honesty. Her tone didn't match the way she had been texting all night. That little inconsistency grew into a whisper in my ear that became a chorus. Maybe she was hiding something. Maybe she still felt something for him. Then, like a stone dropped in still water, it rippled further. A mutual friend, someone who had been at the party, let slip a line that felt harmless at the time. "It was nice catching up with you and Jake. You two seemed deep in conversation." The friend realized immediately they'd said too much, but it was already said. I asked more questions. The details felt sharp. They had stepped outside to talk in the backyard. They had laughed in a way I didn't recognize. There was no dramatic betrayal in the story, no cinematic forbidden kiss. But the night took on a private space where I wasn't present. Being excluded, even from a single corner of someone's life, is a soft injury that keeps hurting. When I confronted her about it, we sat across from each other in a quiet kitchen and tried to untangle truth from fear. She looked at me with those eyes I had loved for so long and said, "We were just catching up." Nothing happened. I wanted to believe that she was telling the whole truth. I wanted to accept it and move on. But she also said, unprompted, "It was awkward having you not there." She admitted that she hadn't invited me because it was an old high school crowd and she thought it would be weird, and because, she added, "I was worried it would be awkward for you." That last part felt like a band-aid on a deeper wound. It implied she made a choice to protect me from embarrassment, but it also implied she had prioritized the comfortable narrative of the night over including the person she loved. After that conversation, the walls changed their angle. There was no yelling, no dramatic scene, just a quiet shift of gravity. She became guarded in small ways, a shorter answer when I asked about her day, a reluctance to share details that had previously been casual, the tightness in her smile when certain names came up. I know jealousy can be toxic, and I tried not to let it corrode what we had. But trust is not a one-time ceremony. It's 100 tiny agreements kept daily. Each time she texted and my mind provided a story, our contract of trust frayed a little more. We tried to mend things. We went out for coffee. We tried to make plans that would remind us of why we chose each other, of the jokes and rituals that build intimacy. There were moments of tenderness, late-night conversations about our imperfect pasts, laughter about shared memories, an easy comfort that made me remember why I had fallen in love. But alongside those moments were persistent, nagging doubts that would not be soothed by a single apology. I would see her smile and wonder who else had seen that smile in a way that mattered. I would ask a simple question and find myself cataloging every hesitation she made. It was as if a thin veil had been placed between us that only I could see. And the more I stared at it, the more visible it became. People ask whether relationships survive secrets and whether they can recover from exclusion. I've come to think it depends on the size of the secret and the willingness of both people to not just say the right words but to change the tiny behaviors that made the secret possible. She apologized for not inviting me. She explained how it felt to be with people who remembered a version of herself before us, before commitments, before responsibility, and how sometimes those memories feel like catching up with an old version of yourself. She said she hadn't meant to hurt me. She said she had wanted a night where she could be someone else for a moment. I understood that longing intellectually. It's human to want to slip into a familiar skin from time to time. But understanding does not erase the sting of being left out. As weeks turned into months, our attempts at repair felt like bandages on a wound that needed stitches. I found myself making rules I didn't like, asking to be invited to every group event, monitoring social media for signs of intimacy, questioning simple kindnesses that used to be unremarkable. Those actions made me feel small and petty and yet somehow necessary in a way that's hard to justify. She, on the other hand, retreated in her own way, less spontaneous texts, fewer late-night calls, more private conversations behind the shield of her phone. The mutual erosion was subtle, a mutual slipping away rather than a blow-up separations you read about in movies. We were in different rooms of the same house, carrying on parallel lives. Eventually we reached the point where we had to admit that our love story was being cannibalized by what we could not say. Breakups are not always loud. Sometimes they are the quiet realization that the person across from you is no longer the person who fits into the same life as you imagined. We parted gently, with gratitude and sadness braided together. There was no betrayal in the classic sense, no affair, no dramatic reveal. The betrayal, if you could call it that, was subtler, the betrayal of omission. The choosing of a private conversation over inclusion. The invisible decisions that accumulate until there is nothing left to hold the relationship up. Walking away from her was not a single moment but an accumulation. There was a last glance at the coffee shop when we said thank you more than I'm sorry. There was a text exchange after the moving boxes were emptied where we both admitted that love can be a kind exile. I did not leave feeling triumphant or vindicated. I left feeling like a bookshelf where a book I loved had been removed. There was space. But the room felt different. Since then, I've been learning what it means to trust myself again. I've learned that inclusion is not entitlement. It's the bedrock of partnership. If someone you love can slip into the twilight of an old romance and forget to pull you along, That forgetfulness is worth addressing, not by surveillance or accusations, but by clear conversations and honest boundaries. I've tried to be kinder to my younger self who sat wondering what had changed. I've tried to understand why nostalgia so often dresses up as harmlessness and why we let it into the room without thinking about the consequences. If there's a lesson here, it's not a neat moral you can pin on a bulletin board. People are complicated, and relationships are complicated too. Sometimes you survive a wound and grow stronger. Sometimes you learn that love and compatibility are different things. It's easy to reduce everything to black and white advice: trust more, communicate better, don't be jealous, but real life lives in the gray spaces between those slogans. For me, the takeaway is this: when someone says, "You're not invited," treat it as data, not destiny. Ask why, tell them how it makes you feel, and if their answers and actions don't align with your need for inclusion and honesty, take that mismatch seriously. I still find myself thinking about that night. Not the party itself, but the small choices that led to our unraveling, the casual exclusion, the unshared texts, the private conversations that felt more important than the person you'd built a life with. Those are the quiet things that sap trust. And yet, after the ache recedes, there's space for something else: self-knowledge, a clearer sense of what I will and won't accept, and a gentler understanding of how people carry the past with them. I hope she found what she was looking for that night. I hope I did too. At the end of it, relationships teach you about the version of yourself you become when you're loved and the version you become when you lose it. Both are true, both are real, and both shape the next person you love. If you're ever told you're not invited, listen to the sting, ask the question, and remember, inclusion is not a favor. It's one of the daily acts that keeps love alive.